Cowboy brought her home, thinking she was injured. Later, he realized it was an Apache marriage ritual. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Silas Mercer was riding slower than usual as he followed the narrow track along the canyon rim. Not because the horse needed it, but because his leg had begun to ache again, the dull reminder of an old break that never set right and never fully left him alone. The sun was dropping fast, turning the ground flat and colorless, and Silas measured the remaining light the way he always did, calculating distance, timing, and whether he had made a mistake by staying out so long. He had not planned to be away from the cabin this late. The fence on the eastern boundary had sagged again, and he had spent more time than expected resetting posts and tightening wire, working alone as he preferred, focused on the simple goal that shaped most of his days: keep the land secure, keep trouble at a distance, and return home without drawing attention. Since leaving organized work years ago, Silas had learned that isolation was not loneliness but protection, and he guarded it carefully. As the path curved toward the wash, something broke the pattern of the land. It was not movement, not sound, but absence, the wrong shape lying where nothing should be. Silas pulled the reins sharply and felt the horse respond at once, trained to stop without question. His first thought was practical and unwelcome. A body meant complications. His second was sharper and colder. If someone had followed him, he had been careless. He slid down from the saddle and stood still, listening. No hooves, no voices, no echo of men lingering just beyond sight. Only wind pushing through dry grass and the faint rustle of loose soil shifting downhill. His hand hovered near his revolver, not drawn, but ready, as he stepped closer and adjusted his angle so the fading light stayed behind him. Then he saw her clearly. A young Apache woman lay just inside the fence line, positioned too neatly to be accidental. One leg bent, the other extended, her dress torn where it had caught and ripped rather than been cut. One sandal was gone entirely. Her exposed foot was scraped and dusty, but not bleeding. Her face was calm in a way that unsettled him, not slack with unconsciousness, not tight with pain, but composed, as if sleep had taken her deliberately. Silas felt a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with fear. This was not the first time he had seen someone push beyond endurance, but it was the first time in years it had happened on his land. He crouched several steps away and studied her breathing, steady but shallow, the kind that came from exhaustion rather than injury. He searched for wounds and found none, which raised new questions he did not yet want answered. His thoughts moved fast, practical, and heavy. Leaving her there meant exposure, cold, and the likelihood that whoever had driven her this far would return. Taking her inside meant risk, attention, and responsibility he had worked hard to avoid. He did not think about law or reputation. He thought about the simple fact that if he rode away, she would not follow. Silas approached slowly, speaking once, quietly, not to ask but to announce himself, his voice low and controlled. She did not respond. He knelt and checked her pulse, feeling life strong enough to persist if given time and shelter. That settled the matter more firmly than any argument he could have made with himself. He lifted her carefully, surprised by how little she weighed, adjusting his hold when her body shifted against him. He felt tension in her muscles, even in sleep, a sign of someone who did not fully surrender to rest, and that awareness sharpened his caution. He did not look at her longer than necessary, not out of distance but restraint, and turned toward the cabin without delay. The gate resisted slightly as he opened it, and he paused long enough to close it again, securing the latch by touch, aware that this single act marked a line crossed whether he acknowledged it or not. The cabin waited ahead, plain and dark against the thinning light, the place Silas had chosen precisely because no one came there unless they meant to. As he carried her across the yard, his mind returned briefly to his own past. Years spent guarding wagon trains, escorting people who trusted him, and a failure that had ended that life. He had not saved everyone then. He had not been fast enough. He had not been careful enough. That weight had shaped every choice since, including this one. By the time he reached the door, night was settling in fully. Silas shifted his stance, opened the door with a shoulder, and stepped inside, already adjusting the space in his mind, already committed to the consequences of sheltering someone he did not yet know. He did not see himself as rescuing her. He saw himself doing the one thing he could live with. She was alive. He was home, and whatever followed would have to be faced in daylight. Silas closed the door behind him with his heel and stood still for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dim interior while he listened to the sounds inside the cabin. The quiet crack of cooling wood, the faint rattle of the stovepipe, the steady breathing of the woman in his arms, which told him she had not fully slipped away. The cabin was exactly as he had left it that morning, spare and orderly. One table, two chairs, the iron stove dark and cold, the narrow bed against the far wall, everything placed for function rather than comfort. He crossed the room slowly, careful not to jar her, and lowered her onto the bed with deliberate movements, easing her back against the thin mattress, straightening her leg so the torn fabric did not pull against her skin. When he withdrew his hands, he noticed the way her fingers curled slightly, as if her body registered the absence of support even in rest, and that small detail stayed with him longer than he expected. Silas stepped back, creating space, his first instinct after any close contact. He rolled his shoulders once, releasing tension he had not realized he was holding, then turned to light the lamp, keeping the flame low. Bright light felt wrong in a situation that still carried uncertainty. He poured water into a tin cup and placed it within her reach, positioning it so it would not spill if she shifted, then folded a second blanket and set it near the bed without covering her, leaving that choice for when she woke. Only then did he allow himself to take her in more fully. Her dress was worn but carefully maintained, the stitching along the hem uneven but intentional, repaired by someone who valued durability over appearance. Her hands bore signs of long travel rather than labor, scraped palms, dirt pressed into the lines of her skin, but no swelling, no fresh injury. He noted all of it the way he would inventory tools or supplies, not detached but controlled. Silas felt the weight of decision settle in his chest. Letting her rest here was no longer a temporary measure. Once she woke, once words were exchanged, whatever they were, the situation would become something that could not be undone quietly. He considered the nearest town, the people there, the questions they would ask if they knew, and dismissed the thought as quickly as it came. He had chosen this land because it was far enough removed that choices could remain private. He took the chair by the wall and sat down, placing his hat on his knee, his posture upright but patient, the way he had learned during long watches years ago. Sleep came lightly, broken by half-awareness, his senses tuned to any change in the room. When she stirred, it was subtle at first, a shift of weight, a change in breath, and Silas was fully awake before her eyes opened. She did not startle. That surprised him. Her gaze moved slowly, taking in the ceiling beams, the lantern, the door, and finally him, sitting several feet away, still and silent. There was no panic in her expression, no rush to sit up or retreat. Instead, she assessed the space with quiet focus, her body tense but composed, as if she had expected to wake somewhere unfamiliar. When she spoke, her English came carefully, each word placed with effort rather than fear. She asked for fire first, then salt. Then she gestured toward the door and asked for a place to sit near it. Silas answered by standing, crossing the room without haste, and fulfilling each request without comment. He lit the stove, set a small dish of salt on the table, and dragged one chair closer to the threshold, positioning it so she could see outside if she wished. Her eyes followed his movements closely. He could feel the attention, not suspicious, but deliberate, measuring his responses the same way he had measured the land earlier that evening. When she shifted to sit, he noticed the stiffness in her joints, the effort it took, and recognized exhaustion layered deeper than muscle alone. Silas spoke only once, his voice low and steady, telling her she was safe for the night. The words felt insufficient even as he said them, but they were honest. He did not promise more than he could guarantee. She inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the statement without accepting it fully, and took the seat near the door, placing her feet flat on the floor, her posture alert. As the hours passed, neither pushed the silence aside. Silas prepared a simple meal, the motions familiar and grounding, and set a bowl on the table without inviting her. She approached only after he sat, ate slowly, and stopped when full rather than when the bowl was empty. That choice struck him as intentional. Nothing about her behavior suggested helplessness. She was conserving, observing, deciding. Later, as the fire burned low, she spread her blanket near the doorway instead of returning to the bed. Silas watched without intervening, understanding that comfort did not always mean softness or warmth. He banked the fire, dimmed the lamp, and returned to his chair, his thoughts heavier now, not with fear, but with the recognition that whatever had brought her here had been planned more carefully than it first appeared. As night settled fully around the cabin, Silas accepted a truth he had avoided since the moment he saw her by the fence. This was not an encounter born of chance or desperation alone. She had arrived with intention, even if he did not yet understand it. And by bringing her across his threshold, he had already taken the first step into something that would demand more than shelter. He did not regret the choice, but he knew it would not end quietly. Morning reached the cabin without announcement, the light arriving thin and pale through the single window, cutting across the floor in a narrow band that stopped just short of the bed. Silas was already awake when it came. He had not slept deeply, not because of fear, but because his mind refused to settle, turning over practical concerns one at a time the way he always did when something new entered his life without warning. He stood at the stove before the woman moved, rolling his shoulders to loosen the stiffness from the chair, setting water to heat with the same steady motions he used every day, careful not to make noise he did not need. He was aware of her presence behind him, not by sound, but by a shift in the room that told him she was no longer fully at rest. When he turned, she was sitting upright on the bed, her back straight, her hands folded loosely in her lap, her expression alert and controlled. She had already re-braided her hair, using a thin strip of leather he had not seen the night before, and the orderliness of that act struck him as deliberate. This was not someone waking confused or disoriented. This was someone resetting herself. Their eyes met briefly. Neither looked away first. There was no challenge in her gaze, but there was no softness either. Silas recognized the look from men he had once ridden with. People who stayed calm, not because they trusted the situation, but because they were prepared for it to change. He nodded once, a small acknowledgement rather than a greeting, and returned to the stove. The water began to steam, and he added grain and salt, stirring slowly, his movements economical. Behind him, he heard her shift her weight, the faint sound of bare feet on wood as she stood. She moved without hesitation, crossing the room to the table, stopping just short of it, waiting. Silas took that in. He had not asked her to sit. He had not offered food yet. She was watching his timing, learning the order of things. When he finally set the bowl down and took his seat, she moved then, sitting across from him rather than beside him, placing her hands on the table edge, her posture formal. They ate in silence. The food was plain, but she did not rush it. She tasted once, adjusted her grip on the spoon, and continued, stopping when she had taken enough, not when the bowl was empty. When she finished, she did not push the bowl away. She simply placed it closer to the center of the table and waited. Silas felt a brief tightening behind his eyes, an unexpected reaction he did not fully understand. He had shared meals before, but rarely like this, with every movement measured, every pause carrying weight. He cleared his own bowl and stood, taking both to the basin, noticing that she watched how he handled them, how he set them down, as if these details mattered. After the meal, she rose and crossed the room without asking, retrieving the broom from where it leaned against the wall. She swept the floor carefully, working from the corners inward, gathering dust and debris with practiced strokes. When she finished, she shook the broom outside, returned it to its place, and stepped back, her task completed. Silas did not thank her, not because he was ungrateful, but because he sensed that word would place the act in the wrong category. This was not service. It was contribution. Later, he stepped outside to check the corral and the fence near the wash, the morning air cool against his face. He expected to hear the door behind him. He did not. When he glanced back, she was standing just inside the threshold, watching him work, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her body positioned so she could retreat or follow with equal ease. He worked slower than usual, aware of being observed, not with suspicion, but with focus. He noticed how she tracked his movements, not his hands alone, but his stance, the way he favored his leg when he shifted weight, the pauses he took before applying force. When he straightened and looked toward the hills, he saw her gaze already there, fixed on the distant line where land met sky. She spoke then, not to him directly, but to the morning, her voice low and steady, the words unfamiliar but clearly intentional. The sound carried briefly, then faded. When she finished, she remained still, as if waiting for something unseen to respond. Silas did not interrupt. He leaned against the fence rail and waited until she turned back toward the cabin on her own. Only then did he follow. Inside, the day continued without discussion. He repaired a loose hinge while she sat at the table, mending the torn edge of her dress with careful stitches, the needle moving with precision that suggested long familiarity rather than recent necessity. He noticed that she did not rush the repair. She worked until it was strong, not until it was hidden. As the sun climbed higher, Silas felt the shape of the situation settle more clearly. She was not stranded in the way he had assumed. She was not waiting to be guided or instructed. Whatever had brought her here had been a decision made before exhaustion forced her to the ground. That understanding brought with it a new kind of responsibility, heavy or not because it demanded action, but because it demanded respect. Silas knew how to protect territory. He knew how to keep people at a distance. What he did not yet know was how to share space with someone who had entered it by design rather than chance. By late afternoon, when shadows began to stretch again, he realized that neither of them had asked the question that lingered between them: how long she intended to stay. And for the first time since leaving the life he once knew, Silas found that the absence of that answer did not trouble him as much as he had expected. The fourth day unfolded with a different weight than the ones before it, not heavier, but more defined, as if the space they shared had begun to accept their presence and now expected consistency in return. Silas woke earlier than usual, the air inside the cabin cool enough to sharpen his focus. And for the first time since bringing her inside, he took a moment to consider how another person altered even the smallest routines. He dressed quietly, pulling on his boots near the door instead of beside the bed, adjusting his movements to avoid startling her, though she was already awake. She sat near the stove, not tending it, simply positioned where warmth would come first once the fire was lit. Her posture was relaxed in a way it had not been before, her shoulders lowered, her hands resting openly on her knees. That change unsettled him more than tension would have. It suggested assessment completed, at least in part. Silas stepped outside before speaking. The morning carried a steady wind from the south, dry and persistent, the kind that pushed dust into every seam and carried sound farther than expected. He walked the fence line with care, checking the section nearest the wash, aware that tracks showed more clearly after dawn. He did not expect trouble, but expectation had failed him before. When he returned, she was standing at the table, examining a length of wire he had left coiled there. She did not touch it at first. She looked at it, then at the section of fence visible through the window, then back to him when he entered. Her question came slowly, the words chosen with care, asking if it was meant to hold or to mend. Silas answered plainly, explaining the weakness in the post and how the wire had stretched. He did not simplify his explanation. He did not test her understanding. He spoke as he would to anyone who needed the information. She listened without interruption, then nodded once and reached for the wire, her grip firm and practiced. They worked side by side without discussion, her holding tension while he reset the post, her adjusting her stance when he shifted, learning his rhythm without instruction. The task took longer than it would have alone, but the result was stronger, the wire set evenly, the post secure. Silas noticed that she did not step back when the work was finished. She remained until he nodded, acknowledging completion. Back inside, the cabin felt altered again, not by objects moved or added, but by the presence of shared effort now anchored in its walls. She prepared a simple meal without asking, using what was available, leaving nothing wasted. Silas watched her work with quiet attention, not because he doubted her intentions, but because he recognized the confidence of someone who acted without seeking permission. When they ate, she chose the seat beside him this time, not across, her movement unannounced and unhesitating. The closeness did not feel intrusive. It felt considered. Silas adjusted his posture slightly, not to retreat, but to acknowledge the change. Neither commented on it. Later in the afternoon, riders passed near the lower trail, their figures distant but deliberate. Silas saw them first and moved toward the window without urgency. She joined him a moment later, standing close enough that he could feel the heat of her body without touching. They watched together as the men slowed near the wash, scanning the land with interest that did not yet rise to threat. Silas stepped outside alone. He did not carry his rifle. He stood where he could be seen clearly, his stance neutral, his hands visible. When the riders called out, asking casual questions that carried sharper intent beneath them, Silas answered without elaboration, his voice flat, his responses brief. He did not lie. He did not offer information. The men studied him, measuring what was worth pushing for, then moved on. When Silas returned inside, she did not ask what had been said. She had already understood enough from posture and timing. That evening, she took a thin cord from her pouch and laid it on the table, not as an explanation, but as a marker of significance. Silas did not touch it. He acknowledged it by clearing space around it, ensuring it was not treated as clutter or forgotten. As night settled in, the wind eased, leaving the cabin quiet in a way that felt earned rather than imposed. She positioned her blanket closer to the bed than before, still near the door, but no longer guarding it as a boundary. Silas noticed the shift and recognized it as trust offered in increments rather than declarations. Before sleeping, she spoke again, explaining a fragment of her custom, not the binding itself, but the importance of thresholds, of crossings made deliberately. Silas listened without interruption, absorbing the meaning without attempting to translate it into his own terms. When she finished, he responded simply, saying that on his land, anyone who stayed did so by choice, and anyone who chose to leave would not be stopped. She accepted that with a calm nod, her expression unchanged, but something in her posture softened, a tension released that Silas had not realized was still present. That night, sleep came more easily to him than it had since she arrived. Not because uncertainty had vanished, but because it had taken shape. Whatever lay ahead would not come from confusion or impulse. It would come from two people continuing to decide, one day at a time, how much space they were willing to share and how firmly they were willing to stand within it. The night settled heavier than the others, not with cold or weather, but with the sense that something unspoken had moved closer to the surface and refused to sink back down. Silas woke once to the sound of the wind striking the cabin at an odd angle, then again to a quieter awareness that someone else was awake inside the room. Not moving, not restless, simply present in a way that sharpened his senses rather than alarming them. He did not open his eyes at first. Years of sleeping lightly had taught him the difference between threat and intention, and this carried neither urgency nor fear. The air felt steady. The fire had burned low, but not out. Then he became aware of a faint pressure at his wrist, not pain, not restraint, just enough contact to register. His body tensed out of instinct, then eased when he realized he could move freely. When morning light crept into the cabin, Silas opened his eyes and saw the thin cord looped around his wrist, tied with a knot he did not recognize, placed with care rather than secrecy. The woman sat at the table, already awake, her posture composed, her hands folded, waiting. She did not look at the cord immediately. She waited until he noticed it himself. Silas sat up slowly, testing the loop, confirming what he already knew. It was not binding. It was symbolic. That distinction mattered more to him than he expected. He rose, crossed the room, and set the kettle on the stove before addressing it, grounding himself in routine before conversation. When he finally spoke, his voice was even, asking her to explain. She did not hesitate. Her words came without drama, without embellishment, delivered as fact rather than persuasion. She spoke of boundaries crossed with intention, of shelter offered freely, of protection given when pursuit had not yet ended. She explained that in her people's law, these acts formed a binding only when the woman chose the place and the man carried her across it knowingly. She told him she had chosen the fence line because it was clear, deliberate, and owned. Silas listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, but his thoughts moved fast. He replayed the moment he found her, the precise way she had been positioned, the absence of panic, the calm in her breathing. He felt a tightening in his chest, not from accusation, but from realization. This had not been accident or collapse alone. It had been strategy born of necessity and resolve. He removed the cord carefully and placed it on the table between them, aligning it parallel to the wood grain, a gesture that reflected his need for order rather than rejection. He told her that no law held meaning without continued choice, that what happened in darkness did not bind daylight unless both parties stood by it when fully aware. She received that without visible disappointment. She nodded once, acknowledging the condition, and said she would stay regardless of his answer. Not because she believed herself already entitled, but because she had decided this place was where she would remain unless forced away. The simplicity of that statement struck Silas harder than any plea could have. There was no bargaining in her voice, no expectation of protection or provision beyond what had already been given. She was stating intention, not asking permission. The day unfolded differently after that. Not strained, not awkward, but deliberate. They worked the land together again, this time repairing a section of fencing farther from the cabin, where the ground dipped and required careful footing. She adjusted her pace to match his without comment, stepping where he stepped, stopping when he stopped. When he struggled briefly with tension on the wire, she repositioned her hands without instruction, solving the problem before it could become one. They spoke little, but when they did, it was precise. She asked questions that showed she understood the risks of staying here, the isolation, the lack of protection from law or town. Silas answered honestly, not minimizing the hardship, not exaggerating the danger. He explained why he lived alone, how past failures had taught him the cost of responsibility accepted lightly. He did not describe the details of what he had lost, but he did not hide the weight of it either. That afternoon, distant movement caught their attention. Riders again, this time closer, their presence unmistakable even before voices carried. Silas assessed the situation quickly. He told her to stay inside, not as an order, but as information. She did not argue. She stood by the window, visible enough to see, hidden enough not to be seen. Silas met the riders outside, positioning himself so the cabin remained behind him. The questions were sharper this time, the interest less casual. He responded with the same restraint, offering nothing that could be pressed further. When they left, it was with reluctance, their glances lingering longer than before. Inside, she was waiting. She did not ask what had been said. She asked only whether they would return. Silas answered truthfully that it was possible. She accepted that without visible concern and moved to prepare the evening meal, her actions steady, unhurried. As night fell, she did not place her blanket by the door. She set it closer to the bed, still separate, still defined, but unmistakably nearer. Silas noticed and understood the significance. Trust, in her terms, was not declared. It was repositioned. Before sleep, Silas took the cord from the table and placed it in the trunk at the foot of the bed. Not hidden, not discarded, but kept with items that mattered and would be revisited. He did not do this for her sake alone. He did it because he recognized that what had begun here was no longer accidental. He lay down knowing that the next decisions would not be about whether she stayed, but about what staying would require of him, not as a rescuer or owner, but as a man choosing to stand where he had already drawn the line. And for the first time in years, That responsibility did not feel like a burden he wanted to escape. The next morning began without ceremony, but the shift in the cabin was unmistakable. It was not quieter or louder, not warmer or colder, but steadier, as if the place itself had adjusted to the fact that two decisions were now being carried instead of one. Silas woke before dawn and lay still for a short while, listening to the even rhythm of the woman's breathing from the other side of the room, noting the distance she had chosen for her blanket and the absence of tension in the air. Nothing felt unresolved, yet nothing felt concluded. He rose carefully, mindful of the floorboards that creaked near the stove, and dressed in the half-light, fastening his shirt with deliberate fingers. As he moved, he became aware of a new consideration settling into his thoughts. Not concern for privacy or safety, but for rhythm. His habits had been shaped by solitude, by doing things when they needed doing and not a moment sooner or later. Now timing mattered in a different way. His choices affected another person's day before it even began. Outside, the air was cool and dry, the sky low and colorless, the kind of morning that promised heat later. Silas checked the corral first, running his hand along the rail, testing for looseness. The fence they had repaired held firm. He noted that with quiet approval. Work done together stayed done longer. When he returned to the cabin, she was already awake, seated at the table with a piece of leather laid flat before her, cutting narrow strips with a steady hand. She glanced up once, acknowledged him with a slight movement of her head, and returned to her task. There was no sense of secrecy in what she was doing, but she did not explain it either. Silas accepted that. Not every action needed to be accounted for. He prepared breakfast without speaking, placing the food where it could be shared rather than served. She joined him when he sat, this time without hesitation, her movements natural, unguarded. They ate slowly, the silence between them no longer careful but occupied, filled with the small sounds of a working morning. Afterward, Silas laid out the day's work, not as instruction, but as information. He explained that the far fence along the rocky slope needed reinforcing, that the ground there was uneven and the footing uncertain. He did not ask if she would help. He assumed she would choose for herself. She listened, then asked a single question about the slope, her concern focused on access rather than difficulty. Silas answered, and she rose immediately, retrieving her boots and tying them with practiced efficiency. That settled the matter. The walk to the slope took longer than usual. The terrain demanded attention, and Silas adjusted his pace to match hers without thinking about it. He noticed how she tested the ground before placing weight, how she watched the land rather than the path, reading the surface for stability. These were not learned behaviors from recent hardship. They were habits built over time. At the fence line, the work required coordination. Silas reset a leaning post while she held the wire taut, her grip firm, her stance balanced. When the wire slipped once, snapping back against her palm, she did not curse or withdraw. She adjusted her hold and continued. Silas felt a flicker of concern, checked her hand, saw the skin unbroken, and returned to the task without comment. He understood restraint as well as she did. They completed the repair by late morning. The fence stood straight, the tension even, the line clean. Silas stepped back and assessed the work, nodding once in approval. She watched his reaction, not for praise, but to confirm outcome. When he nodded, she allowed herself a small release of breath, the only visible sign that the work had mattered. They rested briefly in the shade of a rock outcrop, sharing water without ceremony. Silas noticed the way she drank, not hurried, not cautious, but attentive to need. He found himself doing the same. The moment felt ordinary, which made it significant. On the walk back, Silas spotted movement along the lower trail, dust rising where it should not have been. He stopped, raised a hand, and she halted at once, her attention sharpening without alarm. He told her there were riders nearby and that they might pass close enough to see the cabin. He did not tell her to hide. He told her to be ready. They returned with purpose, not haste. When the riders came into view, Silas stood at the edge of the yard, positioning himself where he could be seen clearly. This time, she did not remain inside. She stood just behind him, visible enough to be noticed, close enough to show alignment without challenge. The riders slowed. Their interest sharpened. Questions followed, more direct than before, their tone less casual. Silas answered with the same control, his voice steady, his posture unyielding. He did not introduce her. He did not explain her presence. He did not deny it either. He stood. She did not speak. She did not look away. She did not retreat. Her presence was quiet, deliberate, unmistakable. The riders lingered longer than Silas liked, but eventually they moved on, their glances backward measuring more than the land. When they were gone, Silas felt the tension leave his shoulders in a way he had not allowed himself to feel before. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere shifted again, not toward relief but toward clarity. She turned to him and asked, directly now, whether standing like that would be enough if the men returned in greater number. The question was not fearful. It was practical. Silas answered honestly. He said it might not be. He said the land was isolated, the law distant, and protection never guaranteed. He did not soften the truth. She considered this, then said that she had already chosen risk over uncertainty, and that standing where she could be seen was part of that choice. Silas felt something settle in his chest at her words. Not pride, not fear, but recognition. She was not seeking shelter alone. She was choosing position. That evening, she cooked while Silas cleaned tools, the division of labor unspoken but balanced. When they ate, the conversation shifted toward winter, toward supplies, toward how long the stored grain might last. Silas realized they were planning without naming it as such, shaping a future through necessity rather than promise. As night fell, she did something new. She moved her blanket fully to the foot of the bed, not sharing it, not crossing a boundary, but eliminating distance. She did not look at him when she did it. She did not wait for acknowledgement. Silas lay awake for a long time, not troubled, not restless, but aware that the shape of his life had changed again, this time not through loss or retreat, but through alignment. He understood now that whatever binding existed between them was not anchored in law or symbol alone, but in the shared act of standing visible and unyielding when it mattered. When sleep finally came, it did so without resistance. And for the first time since he had chosen this land for its isolation, Silas did not feel alone within it. The days that followed carried a different pace, not slower, not faster, but steadier, as if the land itself had accepted a new arrangement and adjusted its expectations accordingly. Silas noticed it first in the mornings, in the way he no longer woke with the same tight readiness in his chest, the reflex that had once pulled him upright at every unfamiliar sound. Now, when he opened his eyes, he took a moment to orient himself, not scanning for threat, but accounting for presence. She rose before him on the seventh morning, moving quietly but without caution, her steps measured rather than hesitant. The fire was already lit when Silas came to the table, the kettle steaming softly, the smell of heated grain filling the cabin. She did not look up immediately. She finished what she was doing first, then turned, acknowledging him with a calm expression that no longer held the sharp edge of evaluation. Silas sat, rubbing a hand once over his face, feeling the grit of sleep still clinging to him. He realized, with a mild sense of surprise, that he had begun to anticipate these mornings, not for comfort or companionship, but for structure. The shared rhythm had settled into something reliable, and reliability was a language he understood well. They spoke more that day than they had before, though still sparingly. The conversation centered on work, on the condition of the far corral, on whether the lower wash would hold water long enough to justify planting later in the season. She listened closely, asked questions that showed she understood land not as scenery, but as responsibility. When Silas explained why he had chosen this particular stretch of ground years earlier, she did not interrupt or comment until he finished. He told her then, not as confession, but as context, that he had once lived among many people, guarding others for pay, believing skill and vigilance were enough to keep everyone safe. He said that belief had cost lives, and when it was gone, he had chosen distance over duty, land over roads, quiet over command. He did not name names. He did not recount events. He explained the result. She accepted that explanation without judgment. When she spoke, she shared something of her own history, not in detail, but in outcome. She said she had learned early that waiting for rescue left too much to chance, and that choosing where to stand mattered more than hoping to be seen. Silas recognized the shared ground in those statements, the way different paths had led them to the same conclusion. Later that morning, she asked if there was a place she could tend herself, something that belonged to her care rather than shared maintenance. The request surprised Silas. No one had asked him for space on his land before without claiming ownership or obligation. He considered it carefully, then pointed toward a narrow strip near the cottonwood where the soil held moisture longer. She walked the area slowly, crouched, sifted the dirt through her fingers, and nodded. That afternoon, she began clearing stones, working methodically, marking the boundaries with small, deliberate placements. Silas watched from a distance, not supervising, not interfering, aware that this act was as significant as any spoken agreement. By mid-afternoon, distant thunder rolled once across the sky. Not a storm, just a reminder of shifting weather. Silas glanced up, calculating. She noticed and followed his gaze. He explained how the sound traveled here, how storms passed without warning but rarely stayed. She filed the information away, already adjusting plans he had not voiced. That evening, as shadows lengthened, a lone rider appeared along the upper trail, slower than the others who had passed before, his posture less confident, his approach measured. Silas saw him first and felt a familiar tightening in his shoulders. One rider meant curiosity, not force, but curiosity carried its own dangers. He stepped outside alone this time, closing the door behind him. The rider stopped at a distance, calling out politely, asking questions that sounded harmless enough on the surface. Silas answered carefully, giving nothing away, his tone firm but uninviting. The man lingered, scanning the land, his eyes drifting toward the cabin. Silas shifted his stance deliberately, blocking the line of sight without appearing aggressive. The rider studied him a moment longer, then tipped his hat and moved on, leaving behind the unsettled feeling of interest deferred rather than resolved. When Silas returned inside, she was standing near the table, her attention fixed on his face rather than the door. She did not ask who the man was. She asked what kind of interest he carried. Silas answered honestly, saying it was the kind that grew if fed and moved on if starved. She considered this, then said quietly that visibility could be managed, but roots could not. The statement struck Silas as practical rather than symbolic. She was speaking about staying long enough to be known, not hidden. That night, she brought out the cord again, not placing it between them, but holding it loosely in her hands as she spoke. She explained more of her people's law, not the binding itself, but what followed it, the expectation of shared labor, shared defense, shared endurance. She made it clear that none of it erased choice, that staying was renewed daily through action rather than vow. Silas listened, absorbing the structure beneath the words. It was not so different from how he lived already. He told her that in his understanding, partnership meant standing when it would be easier to step back, and staying when leaving would cost less. He did not call it marriage. He called it commitment. She nodded, satisfied with that definition. She did not press further. She did not ask for reassurance. She took the cord and returned it to her pouch. The matter settled for now. As they prepared for sleep, Silas noticed another change. She placed her few belongings along the wall beside his tools, not mixing them, not separating them either, aligning them carefully as if marking coexistence rather than merger. The gesture carried intention without demand. Silas lay awake for a long while, staring at the ceiling beams, listening to the wind pass through the grass outside. He felt the weight of responsibility settle differently now, not as something imposed, but as something shared. The land was no longer a buffer between him and the world. It was becoming a point of connection. When he finally slept, it was deeply, without the fractured vigilance of earlier nights. And when morning came again, it did not feel like a question waiting to be answered, but like another day already claimed. Autumn arrived without ceremony, not announced by color or cold, but by the way the air thinned and carried sound farther than before. Silas noticed it in the mornings when the yard felt larger than it used to. The silence stretched wider, every movement distinct against the open land. The cabin stood unchanged, but the work around it had begun to organize itself around preparation rather than repair. They did not name the season aloud. They simply adjusted to it. Silas spent the early hours inventorying supplies, laying items out on the table with the same methodical attention he once used when planning long escorts, checking grain, salt, tools, ammunition, and the condition of the stove. She watched for a time, then joined him, not touching anything until he paused, then pointing out what could be supplemented from the land and what would need protection from damp and cold. Her understanding of scarcity was precise. She spoke in terms of weeks, not hopes. Together, they restructured the cabin without discussion. Shelves were reinforced. A second water barrel was moved closer to the wall where it would freeze last. She stitched heavy cloth into a draft barrier for the door, working late into the evening, her hands steady even as the light faded. Silas noticed that she hummed softly while she worked, not a song he recognized, but a controlled sound that matched her pace and kept her focus anchored. Outside, the land required different attention now. They cleared deadwood from the tree line, stacked it high, and covered it carefully. Silas adjusted the corral gate so it would not warp when frost came. She gathered plants from the higher ground, drying them on a rack she built herself near the stove. She explained their use briefly, not as instruction, but as shared knowledge. Silas accepted it the same way he accepted changes in weather, as information that improved survival. One afternoon, as the sky dimmed earlier than expected, a group of riders appeared again, farther out this time, their figures dark against the pale ground. Silas spotted them from the ridge and slowed his pace deliberately. She followed his gaze and understood immediately. There was no tension in her posture, but there was readiness. They did not retreat to the cabin. They finished what they were doing, closed the gate, and stood together in the open yard where they could be seen clearly. Silas positioned himself slightly forward, not blocking her, not exposing her, simply present. She remained beside him, not touching, not stepping back. The riders did not approach. They circled once, assessing, then continued on their way. Silas tracked them until they disappeared behind the rise. Only then did he allow himself to breathe out fully. He felt the familiar edge of unease return briefly, the reminder that attention could return with numbers and intent. Inside, she asked him directly whether the land would hold if tested. Silas did not soften his answer. He said it could be defended, but never guaranteed. He said standing visible discouraged some threats and invited others. He said he would not promise safety where certainty did not exist. She listened, then replied that certainty was not what she had chosen. She said permanence mattered more than protection that depended on movement. The statement carried no accusation, no demand. It was simply a line drawn. That evening, they shared a longer meal than usual, not celebratory, but thorough, as if acknowledging the shift in their circumstances. Silas realized that he was no longer measuring time by daylight alone, but by what could be accomplished before the next cold set in. She was doing the same. Later, as the fire settled into a steady burn, she retrieved the cord once more. This time she did not place it on the table. She held it briefly, then tied it around a wooden peg near the door, not as a claim, but as a marker. She explained that it was customary to leave such signs visible when a bond was recognized by both parties, not hidden, not worn, but acknowledged in the open. Silas considered this carefully. He did not object. He did not agree verbally either. Instead, he took one of his own possessions, a small iron token he had carried since leaving his old work, and placed it beside the cord on the peg. It was not symbolic by design. It was simply something he no longer needed to keep to himself. The gesture settled something between them without discussion. That night, as they prepared to sleep, she moved her bedding fully beside his, still separate, still defined, but aligned in orientation and space. Silas noticed the change and accepted it without comment. He understood now that proximity was not a step taken lightly for her. It was a decision reaffirmed through action. As the fire dimmed and the wind pressed against the walls, Silas lay awake longer than usual, not restless, but reflective. He thought of the life he had chosen after loss, the careful distance he had built around himself, and how quietly that distance had been crossed without force or deception. He recognized that what he felt now was not surrender, but participation. Outside, the land settled into its autumn stillness. Inside, two people adjusted their positions again, not closer in body, but closer in purpose. Whatever winter brought, it would meet them already standing, already committed to the place they had chosen to hold together. Winter did not arrive as an enemy. It came the way Silas had always known it would, gradually, with firmer mornings, longer shadows, and the kind of cold that asked preparation rather than courage. By the time the first hard frost settled into the ground, the cabin stood ready, not fortified, but complete, shaped by weeks of deliberate choices and steady labor that no longer belonged to one person alone. Silas woke before dawn on the morning the snow finally came. He lay still for a moment, listening, not for danger, but for familiarity. The sound of the wind against the walls was even. The fire had held through the night. Beside him, she slept without tension, her breathing slow and unguarded, a state he understood as trust earned rather than assumed. He rose quietly, pulled on his boots, and stepped outside. The land had changed overnight. Snow covered the yard in a thin, clean layer, smoothing out the rough edges of the ground, settling into fence lines and posts without strain. The sky was pale and clear. There were no tracks yet. The world felt held. Silas stood there longer than necessary, taking it in, not because he feared what winter would bring, but because he recognized the significance of standing here and now with someone who had chosen the same ground without hesitation. When he returned inside, she was already awake, seated at the table, wrapping her hands around a cup he had not yet noticed her pour. She looked up and met his eyes without the reserve that had once shaped every glance. There was no question in her expression, no search for reassurance, only presence. They ate together as they always did now, the meal simple, the silence unforced. Afterward, she dressed for the cold, layering carefully, tying her boots with practiced motions. Silas watched her prepare and realized that nothing about her movements suggested waiting. She was not pausing for direction. She was acting within a life she already considered hers. Later that morning, they walked the perimeter together, checking the fence, the corral, the stored wood. Snow crunched beneath their steps. The repairs they had made held firm. The land responded as it always had a care taken seriously. Silas felt a quiet satisfaction settle in his chest, the kind that came from work done well and shared fully. When they returned to the cabin, she paused at the door and touched the peg where the cord and iron token hung side by side. The gesture was brief, not ceremonial, but it carried weight. She turned to him and spoke plainly, saying that winter marked renewal in her understanding, not endurance alone, and that choosing to remain through it meant choosing permanence without condition. Silas listened and responded without hesitation. He said that on this land, staying meant shared responsibility, shared defense, and shared future, and that he would not mark that choice with spectacle or witnesses. He would mark it by standing every day without retreat. The words were not rehearsed. They were simply true. She accepted them as such. That afternoon, they did something neither had planned. Silas took a length of wood he had set aside long ago and shaped it carefully, smoothing the edges, carving two names into its surface, not ornate, not decorative, but clear and lasting. When he finished, he showed it to her without explanation. She traced the letters once, her touch steady, then nodded. Together, they fixed it above the door. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that no longer required adjustment. Snow came and went. Work continued. Silence filled the spaces between them without strain. At night, they shared the same bed, not out of urgency or claim, but out of ease, the closeness natural, the boundaries respected because they no longer needed guarding. There were no riders that winter. No questions asked. The land held. The cabin held, and when spring returned at last, it did so gently, revealing a homestead shaped not by isolation, but by alignment. On a clear morning, months later, Silas stood beside her at the fence line where it had begun, watching the grass push back through thawed ground. He realized then that what had once been a boundary had become an anchor, a place chosen and reaffirmed not once, but many times. She stood beside him, her shoulder resting lightly against his arm, not claiming, not yielding, simply there. The life ahead of them was not uncertain. It was defined by work, by care, by decisions made openly and kept without exception. Silas closed the gate and turned back toward the cabin with her at his side. They went inside together. The door closed, and the home they had built remained exactly where it belonged.